The apartment was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like something sacred has died inside it. And as Naomi stood barefoot on the hardwood floor holding her phone in a hand that trembled like it didn't belong to her anymore, she realized the calls weren't going to be returned. Not today. Not ever again. And in that silence, something inside her gave out, like a wall collapsing without warning, burying what little strength she had left. Just yesterday, she had texted her best friend, only to see the message sit unread. And last week, her fiancé had walked out the door with nothing but a backpack and the phrase, "I just don't think I can do this anymore," leaving the engagement ring on the counter beside a cup of cold coffee. No explanation, no discussion, just absence. Naomi stared at the blinking voicemail notification, knowing it was her mother, who called from 1,000 miles away out of obligation rather than affection, always ready to tell her what she was doing wrong, but never once asking how she was really holding up. There was no one left, no one who knew the full weight of her story, the history behind the quiet strength she used to carry, or the loneliness she had learned to camouflage behind her job title and polite nods in elevators. When her father died the year before, the grief hit hard, but this was different. This wasn't loss through death. This was loss by abandonment, like the world had silently voted her out of its orbit and just kept spinning without her. She looked around the room filled with half-packed boxes, a suitcase that hadn't moved in weeks, and a pile of unopened mail on the floor where it had fallen. Naomi had tried, truly, to keep functioning, but some mornings she couldn't even tell what day it was. Her Bible sat on the bookshelf untouched, its leather cover gathering dust, just another reminder of a God who used to feel close but now seemed like an idea people clung to when they couldn't handle the weight of real life. And the church. She hadn't stepped inside one in over a year. Not since the sermon on God never leaving you. Felt like a cruel joke against the echoing silence she felt every time she knelt to pray. Naomi sank to the floor, letting her back press against the wall, and curled her knees to her chest like a child seeking shelter from a storm no one else could see. She scrolled through her phone, hoping for a single message, a missed call, anything to prove she hadn't vanished from everyone's mind. But all she found were old pictures of people she used to trust, used to love. People who had now faded from her world like dreams that dissolve in morning light. Even social media had become unbearable, each post a reminder of connection, of belonging, of moments she no longer had access to. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "Maybe you really are forgettable." And for the first time in a long while, she didn't argue with it. Her appetite vanished, replaced by the aching knot that made her stomach feel like a hollow drum, and even her reflection looked like a stranger. Sunken eyes, brittle hair, and a smile that hadn't been seen in weeks. Naomi remembered being the one people turned to for comfort, for advice, for prayer, and now she couldn't even bring herself to whisper God's name without feeling ridiculous. She hated that she still hoped, still longed for someone to notice her absence, still checked her phone at midnight like a teenager waiting for a text from someone who no longer cared. In desperation, she decided to clean, to do something, anything, that would make her feel human again. And that's how she ended up in her grandmother's attic, surrounded by dust, forgotten Christmas ornaments, and memories that stung more than they soothed. She hadn't been there since the funeral, hadn't dared to open the boxes labeled Naomi's childhood, because she wasn't sure if she'd be able to handle what they held. One box in particular caught her eye, a small wooden chest, hand-carved with a rose on the lid, the latch slightly rusted but still intact. She opened it expecting old letters or maybe family photos, but inside she found something she hadn't seen in over a decade. A pale blue Bible with her name engraved on the front in fading silver foil. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was hers, a gift from her grandmother when she was only 10 years old, back when faith was simple, and she used to underline verses with sparkly gel pens and believe that angels really watched her sleep. The pages were worn and soft at the edges, the corners turned up in places where her younger self had read the same verse over and over again. As she flipped through the Bible, a folded note fell out, a torn piece of lined paper, yellowed with time, with just one verse written in her. Grandmother's familiar cursive, Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Her breath caught. That verse had been underlined, circled, starred. Beside it, in her grandmother's shaky handwriting, were 3 words. "This is for Naomi." She sat there frozen, staring at those words like they were a message from another world. From a woman who had died with her faith intact and who somehow knew her granddaughter would need these words more than oxygen one day. Naomi didn't cry. She couldn't. But something cracked inside her. Something subtle but unmistakable, like a door swinging slightly open in a house long abandoned. She didn't understand why her grandmother chose that verse, didn't know what it meant to be saved when you already felt invisible. But she clutched the Bible to her chest and whispered for the first time in months, "God, are you still there?" The room was still silent, but this time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like waiting. Naomi didn't sleep that night, not because of noise, but because the silence now had a shape to it, like a presence in the room that didn't speak but wouldn't leave, and though the weight of loneliness still wrapped around her like a soaked blanket. The verse from the Bible kept whispering itself into her thoughts, like a breath that refused to fade. She sat in the dim glow of her kitchen at 3:17 a.m., clutching a chipped mug of tea she had reheated 3 times, her grandmother's Bible resting open on the table beside unpaid bills and a wilting plant she had forgotten to water weeks ago. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly tilted, as if the despair hadn't lifted but had paused just long enough to let something else flicker through the cracks. In the morning, Naomi moved like a ghost through her day, going to work out of muscle memory, answering emails without reading them, smiling at coworkers with just enough warmth to be left alone. But beneath the surface, the silence from God had become the loudest part of her life. It wasn't angry silence anymore. It was just silence. Like standing outside a house with no lights on, unsure whether anyone was inside. That week, she skipped dinner 3 times, avoided phone calls from her mom, and only spoke when required. But every night she opened the Bible again, her fingers tracing the curve of her grandmother's handwriting, like a prayer she couldn't quite say aloud. On Thursday, the sky turned gray with spring rain, and she found herself sitting in the park her family used to visit every Sunday after church, the one with the wooden benches under sprawling oak trees that seemed older than memory itself. She didn't know why she went there. It wasn't a conscious decision. But something about the gentle drizzle and the scent of wet bark felt familiar, like a time capsule of comfort buried beneath years of exhaustion. Sitting alone on the farthest bench, Naomi ran her fingers across the initials carved into the wood, NS plus GJ, hers and her childhood best friend's, now barely legible after so many seasons had passed without either of them returning. A man sat on the next bench over, elderly, wearing a tweed hat and a brown coat that looked worn but clean. And without looking at her, he spoke as if reciting from memory. "He hasn't forgotten you." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't looking at her, didn't acknowledge her after that, just stood and walked away, cane tapping softly against the stones, vanishing down the path like a character from a dream. She didn't know if he meant God, or someone else, or nothing at all, but the words embedded themselves in her like a seed cracking through cold soil. That night she picked up the Bible again and returned to Psalm 34, reading verse 18 slowly, then again, until the words began to sound like a rhythm instead of a sentence. Close to the brokenhearted. Close to the brokenhearted. The next morning, after brushing her teeth but before putting on makeup, she did something she hadn't done in over a year. She Googled the address of her grandmother's old church, the small one with white siding and creaky pews, the one she used to sit in as a child staring at stained glass that shimmered like heaven. It was still open, still holding Sunday services, and the website said one was starting in 18 minutes. Her hands shook as she pulled on jeans and a coat. No time to overthink, just move. Like her feet were obeying something her heart hadn't agreed to yet. The drive felt surreal, like drifting through a fog of memory. She passed the bakery where she used to get cinnamon rolls after church, the gas station where her granddad always stopped for peppermints, and finally the faded white sign that read, "Hope Chapel, come as you are." She sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, half convinced this was ridiculous. But something, maybe grief, maybe hope, maybe just curiosity, dragged her out of the car and up the steps. The sanctuary hadn't changed. The wood still smelled like lemon polish and old pages. The air felt warmer than it should have. And as she stepped inside, no one stared. Only one elderly woman smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't ask questions, but makes room. Naomi slid into the back pew, farthest from the pulpit, and let the sound of an off-key piano and murmured greetings wash over her like soft rain against a window. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just sat, breathing, existing, letting herself feel something other than numbness. The pastor, a man she didn't recognize, began the service by saying, "Some of us feel forgotten, but Scripture says God's memory never fails." Naomi didn't know if he was talking to her, but it felt like he was. After the service, she lingered near the doorway, unsure if she should stay or leave, until the same elderly woman who had smiled at her earlier walked up, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "I'm so glad you came home, sweetheart." Naomi hadn't introduced herself, hadn't said a word, yet somehow the woman knew. That night, she sat on her apartment floor, the Bible on her lap, and whispered something she didn't even recognize as a prayer. "God, if you're really near, I want to know." The silence that followed wasn't filled with angels or answers or signs, but it also wasn't empty. For the first time in a long, aching while, it wasn't empty. Naomi returned to the little church the following Sunday, not out of habit, but because something inside her ached for stillness, for that fragile, sacred quiet that had followed her whispered prayer in the dark. And this time, when she walked through the doors and took her place in the back pew, she didn't feel like a visitor or a ghost. She felt like someone beginning to remember a language she once spoke fluently, before silence took its place. After the service, while the congregation milled about sharing coffee and crumbling cookies, Naomi wandered through the side hallway, lined with old Sunday school rooms, the walls decorated with faded construction paper scriptures, and drawings made by children who were now probably adults with their own grief tucked behind practiced smiles. She paused by the third door on the left, the one she vaguely remembered. Room 3B, where she used to sit with her legs swinging under her chair, asking questions too big for her young mouth, and laughing when Miss Ellie handed out stickers for memorizing verses. Just as she turned to leave, she heard her name spoken with a softness that made her stomach flip. Not because it was sharp, but because it was familiar. She turned and saw her, Ellie Roberts, her old Sunday school teacher, now with silver hair, deep lines around her eyes, and the same warm presence Naomi remembered from all those years ago. "You came back," Ellie said. Not as a question, but as a statement of fact, her hands opening like they had been waiting to embrace Naomi for a long, long time. They sat in the fellowship hall for nearly an hour, sipping tea from mismatched mugs and catching up in pieces. But it wasn't long before Naomi's polite composure began to crack like a dam under pressure, and tears, unfiltered, uninvited, started slipping down her cheeks as she said, I think I broke somewhere along the way, and I don't know how to come back from that." Ellie didn't flinch, didn't try to fix her or offer empty encouragement. Instead, she nodded, set her tea down, and said, "Then maybe you're right where he wants you," before reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded page of notes. Naomi looked down at the paper. It was a copy of Psalm 34, scribbled with Ellie's own notes in blue ink, arrows pointing to the words, "close to the broken-hearted," and underlined twice. And she realized Ellie had been studying the same verse, clinging to it like a life raft in a storm of her own. "My son died 10 years ago," Ellie said, her voice steady but soft. "And for 2 years, I couldn't walk into this building without feeling like God had vacated the premises. But somehow, every time I tried to throw him away, that verse pulled me back." Naomi felt the weight of that testimony settle deep in her chest, not as a burden, but as a companion, and suddenly her own pain didn't feel quite so isolated. It felt witnessed. That week, Naomi visited her grandmother's grave for the first time since the funeral, bringing fresh flowers and the blue Bible tucked under her arm like a conversation piece she hadn't finished reading. The cemetery was quiet, damp from the morning rain, and as she stood before the stone that bore her grandmother's name, she felt the full ache of everything she'd been carrying. The losses, the betrayals, the bitter, unanswered prayers. And with trembling hands, she knelt in the grass and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me how hard life would be after you left? Why did everyone go?" Her voice cracked on the word, everyone. And for a moment, she imagined her grandmother sitting beside her like she used to in the pews, hand over hand, smile calm and certain, saying, "They didn't forget you. They just got lost in their own storms." Naomi wasn't ready to believe it, not yet. But she opened the Bible anyway and turned again to Psalm 34:18, letting the words soak into the silence between her questions. That night, while rereading the book of Psalms, she noticed something unusual. A second piece of folded paper tucked deep into the back cover of the Bible. One she hadn't seen before, yellowed with time and nearly brittle with age. Carefully unfolding it, she found a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, addressed simply, "To my Naomi, for the day you feel invisible." The letter didn't offer solutions or platitudes. It spoke of her grandmother's own seasons of abandonment, of prayers met with silence, of feeling forgotten by her church, her friends, even by God. And yet every paragraph ended with the same refrain: "He was closer than I knew." Naomi read the letter 3 times, each time slower, her tears staining the paper until the ink bled into the creases. And when she finished, she whispered the words aloud, "Closer than I knew." The following Sunday, she arrived at church, early, walking the halls alone until she reached the sanctuary and knelt in front of the wooden altar that had stood there longer than she'd been alive. She wasn't there to ask for anything. She was there to offer something, her pain, her confusion, her anger, all of it placed at the feet of the one who may have been silent but never absent. "If you've really been close this whole time," she prayed, her voice breaking, "then teach me how to feel you again, because I don't want to spend the rest of my life searching faces that will never stay." As she sat in the pew afterward, Ellie found her and pressed a small wooden cross into her palm. "I carried this for years," she said, "until I realized I didn't need to hold it to believe. Now it's your turn." That night, Naomi wrote in her journal for the first time in 6 months. Not because she had answers, but because she had questions that finally felt safe to speak aloud. Her final line read, "I think I'm beginning to understand that pain doesn't mean absence. It just means I haven't listened long enough." The days that followed were not magical, not immediately full of light, but something inside her began to shift. An ache that once screamed now whispered. A loneliness that once demanded explanation now sat beside her like a companion rather than an enemy. One night, while standing in the grocery store, she saw a young woman crying silently near the frozen food aisle, trying to steady her breathing while staring at a carton of eggs like it held the answers to everything. Without thinking, Naomi stepped closer and simply said, "It won't always hurt this much," then walked away. She didn't need to stay. The words were enough. And that night, as she reread Psalm 34:18 one more time, she realized something she hadn't dared admit before, that maybe God had never left her at all. Maybe he'd just been waiting behind every moment she tried to survive, ready to whisper, "I was there when they left, and I never moved." It began with rain, the slow, rhythmic tapping of it against her bedroom window one early morning as Naomi lay still beneath the blankets, not asleep, not awake, simply suspended in a soft in-between where the world felt muted, and her thoughts, for once, weren't trying to strangle her with urgency or guilt, or the ache of who hadn't called back. She listened without moving, letting the gentle sound fill the hollow places in her chest that used to throb with desperation, and as the sky wept in slow, steady drops, something opened inside her. Not a breakthrough, not a miracle, but a deep, quiet shift, like a locked door unlatching without a sound. That day, she lit a candle and sat beside the window, Bible in her lap. Not to study, not to ask, not to beg, but simply to be, to breathe, to let herself be witnessed by the God she was finally beginning to believe hadn't left her after all. Her tea cooled untouched as the hour passed, and in that silence, a thought floated to the surface. Is it possible he was speaking all along, but I never learned how to listen? She whispered it out loud, the words unfamiliar and sacred on her tongue, and felt a warmth settle over her shoulders like a shawl pulled gently by invisible hands. Over the next few weeks, Naomi's life didn't transform with thunder or trumpets. There were no angelic visitations or burning bushes, but the world began to soften around the edges, and the spaces she had once filled with grief and silence now pulsed with a kind of sacred presence that followed her from room to room like sunlight that refused to be shut out. She returned to church each Sunday, not out of fear or obligation, but with the same hunger that draws the weary to water, and in her small group she began to share. Not stories of triumph, but testimonies of surviving the storm long enough to see a single verse become an anchor. One Thursday night, a new girl joined their circle, a teenager named Lila, eyes hollow, hoodie drawn tight around her like armor, and when it came time for prayer requests, Lila muttered, I feel invisible. Something in Naomi cracked open again, but this time not from pain, from recognition. And as the others bowed their heads, she gently passed her a folded note with one verse written in soft ink. Psalm 34:18. Lila read it, didn't speak, but her eyes met Naomi's, and something passed between them. Sisterhood forged in silence, not sympathy. Naomi had become someone she never imagined she'd be. Not the girl who had it all together, not the woman with answers, but a vessel of presence, of stillness, of peace in someone else's storm. That Saturday she returned to the attic for the last time, not to search but to give thanks, and as she cleared the last of the boxes, she found a notebook belonging to her grandmother titled Letters I Never Mailed. She flipped through them, tears brimming as she read page after page written to people who had hurt her grandmother, left her, ignored her. And yet every letter ended with the same line. I forgive you, even if you never come back, because I will not live bound to silence. Naomi understood now. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing what happened, it was about refusing to carry it anymore. That night, she wrote her own letters. Not to send, not to burn, just to say the things she had carried in her bones for far too long. To the fiancé who left without a word, to the friends who stopped calling, to the God I thought abandoned me. And in every one, she ended the same way. You are forgiven. I'm choosing peace. With the final envelope sealed and tucked away, she knelt beside her bed, Bible open, candle lit, and finally prayed. Not for healing, not for answers, but for more of this stillness, this quiet ground where God now met her like dew in the morning. The next day she walked into the chapel early and found Ellie kneeling by the altar alone, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. And without a word, Naomi sat beside her, placed a hand over hers and whispered, I'll stay with you. They said nothing else. No scripture, no platitudes, no instructions, just presence. Two women who had both been forgotten by the world, but found by the same faithful whisper. As days turned to weeks, Naomi started volunteering at the local shelter, not because she felt strong enough, but because she knew what it meant to need someone who didn't flinch at sorrow. She folded clothes, served coffee, listened to stories that mirrored her own, and offered only one truth again and again. You're not forgotten. One evening, a woman with hollow cheeks and trembling hands sat beside her and asked, Why are you really here? Naomi paused, breathed deep and answered, Because God didn't give up on me, and I won't give up on anyone else. The woman didn't respond. It was on the Sunday of the church's 125th anniversary, with the pews filled beyond capacity, and the old sanctuary wrapped in floral arrangements and framed black and white photos from generations past, that Naomi finally felt what she hadn't dared to hope for since the day her world cracked open, a belonging that asked nothing in return. The building seemed to breathe with stories older than her, and as she walked through the foyer lined with yellowing bulletins and decades-old group photos, she overheard laughter, caught pieces of testimony, and watched families reunited over potluck casseroles and childhood memories. Still, It was the quiet table near the back that held the greatest surprise. Ellie waved her over and handed her a small white envelope, yellowed at the edges, with Naomi's name written in familiar looping cursive. It had been discovered behind the old communion table during renovations, tucked between two cracked floorboards like a secret, waiting for the right moment to be seen. With trembling hands, Naomi opened it, the scent of lavender and thyme rising from the folds like a forgotten lullaby. And inside was a handwritten note from her grandmother, dated the year before her death, titled simply, "For Naomi, on the day you feel like you've disappeared." The letter was short, but soaked in love. You'll search faces for comfort. You'll wonder why silence is louder than kindness. But when the ache becomes too sharp, turn to Psalm 34:18. I circled it for a reason. He is there, sweetheart, even when you feel erased. Naomi's knees nearly buckled as she sat down, letter against her chest, heart echoing with something too deep for language. But in that moment, she knew with unshakable clarity that she had never been forgotten, not by her grandmother, not by God, and not even by the version of herself who had once believed joy was permanent. The sermon that morning was brief, but as if scripted by heaven itself, the pastor read only one verse from the pulpit before sitting down. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Naomi closed her eyes and felt the truth of it radiate through her bones, not as poetry, but as a lived reality she had carried in blood and memory, like a scar now shining gold at the seams. In the weeks that followed, Naomi didn't go back to her old life. She didn't chase the people who had walked away or try to resurrect relationships that had proven brittle. But she did step fully into the quiet, steady rhythm of a life anchored in presence, healing, and purpose. She began mentoring younger women at the church, not by preaching, but by sitting beside them in silence, holding their hands during worship, passing them scriptures on torn napkins when words wouldn't come. At the shelter, she became known not for advice but for availability, the one who remembered birthdays, who brought fresh socks and handwritten notes that always ended with, "You matter." One day, while sweeping the chapel entryway, she saw a woman sitting alone on the front steps, eyes swollen from tears, her clothes tattered, her spirit visibly cracking. And without hesitation, Naomi knelt beside her and whispered the line that had once shattered and rebuilt her all at once. "You're not invisible. You've been seen this entire time." The woman wept into her arms, and Naomi didn't move, didn't explain, didn't fix. She simply stayed. And in that holy stillness, the line between giver and receiver blurred, until both were wrapped in the same sacred comfort. Naomi visited her grandmother's grave again, not to ask questions or seek signs, but to say thank you. Thank you for the Bible, the letters, the prayers whispered into darkness years before they bloomed. She knelt in the grass and said, "I'm okay now. Not perfect, but okay," and left behind a single sprig of lavender and a copy of Psalm 34:18 written in fresh ink. She no longer looked for herself in the faces that walked away, no longer blamed God for the silence that once haunted her, because she now understood that the silence had been an invitation, not abandonment. When her old friend from childhood finally reached out months later, apologizing for the absence, for not being there when Naomi needed her most, Naomi smiled gently and replied, "I'm not angry. I've been found where I least expected it." They met for coffee, not to reopen wounds, but to begin again, with grace instead of explanations. Naomi's apartment looked different now, brighter, softer, lived in, with sticky notes of scripture taped to the mirror, candles flickering beside her window, and a growing stack of letters she kept writing to women she hadn't met yet, beginning each one with "Dear Forgotten One," and ending with, "You are closer to being found than you think." She began speaking softly at women's gatherings, sharing her story not with grandeur but honesty, beginning every testimony the same way. "I didn't find God in the light. I found him in the silence." People listened, wept, nodded, not because her story was unique, but because it was theirs too, echoing through broken hearts like a verse passed from one soul to another. One evening, while sitting quietly at a shelter table, a girl asked Naomi what had finally changed everything. What moment had made the pain stop? And Naomi thought for a long time before answering. It didn't stop, but it became holy. She now understood the strange perfection in her pain. Not that it was good, but that it led her straight into the arms of a God who never flinched from sorrow. Her life didn't explode with new beginnings. It simply deepened into a steady heartbeat of peace, of presence, of holy attentiveness to those the world keeps overlooking. As she walked home one night beneath a sky dusted in stars, the city still humming around her, Naomi whispered Psalm 34:18 into the breeze, not as a cry for help, but as a hymn of memory. And in that moment, with street lamps glowing and her heart finally quiet, she smiled through tears and spoke one last truth that had taken a lifetime to understand. I was never forgotten. I was just being held.